situation. I know this. He can have, yeah, there is the handshake, e4 on the board. What I wanted to highlight that sometimes he has like 4 seconds on the clock. His opponent has 1 minute. And if he believes that he has slight chance to continue the game, he continues with two or 4 seconds also to play for a win.
And that's sort of tricky for players to manage because they often think, oh, my opponent's in time trouble, let me punish them. But Artemiev, Grishuk, all of these players, so good with just a few seconds on the clock. And both players here playing very quickly. In fact, Magnus has more time than he started with. What do you make of the opening here, Peter? Do you think it's more Magnus' style or Artemiev's?
Oh. Well, it's kind of very funny that Magnus normally never allows the marshal, but he felt like, okay, against Vladislav, let me try. Will he dare to play d5? Vladislav took a little time. He paused for like 10 seconds, but nevertheless, he opted for d5. And Magnus declines the marshal. He does not take the pawn. He does not take the sacrifice. He goes d4 himself. This is quite an unorthodox way of fighting the marshal gambit.
I like it though, because it's forcing Artemiev to think, and Magnus, when he's ahead in the clock, he often punishes you. So we see a isolated pawn for white, the d4 pawn. For black, you have this kind of backwards pawn on c7, which has a knight in front of it. So there's good control of squares for white, but there is the weakest pawn on the board for white, the isolated pawn in endgames. That will be a problematic piece.
Well, it's all about how to develop your pieces. Yeah, I believe that if black is comfortably getting out, then it's all fine. The big question is, can you play the desired bishop g4 move, for example? Yeah, can you pin that knight? But what are the consequences? Artemiev goes for the solid bishop f6. Magnus blitzes out the move knight c3 instantly. That's the whole point of white's play.
I wouldn't take that knight, because if knight takes b takes c3, the d4 pawn is defended, and white has more pawns in the center, and that bishop on b3 stares across the diagonal. But if I don't take on c3, I don't know if I believe in bishop e6. Sometimes there are even exchange sacrifices in the square, but more pertinently, knight e4 is coming, and that knight will reroute itself.
Wow! And actually, Artemiev has gone for knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop f5. He plays in the Petrov spirit. I do feel like this is very much a Petrov. It's not a marshal anymore. He wants to play knight a5, hit that bishop, eventually follow it up with c5, or just trade the light square bishop if Magnus is going back to c2, which would be clearly very good news for black. White has to be energetic in order to make the maximum out of this position.
And they say you need plans in chess, but I'm worried about the slow plan. And it's not on the board, it's on the clock. Look at Artemiev's time, Peter. He's down to about 1 minute, 15 seconds compared to Magnus's 2 minutes and 40 seconds. You just can't give that much extra time to Magnus, perhaps unless you are Artemiev. As you said, he can play so well with no time on his clock.
Yeah, exactly. I think that for Artemiev, it's very important to get his type of positions. And if he gets them, then he's not afraid being low on the clock. Yeah, Magnus goes bishop a3, trying to hit that rook on f8 and trying also to give black the opportunity to think. Yeah, please burn some more time. Do you include the move knight takes b3? Or do you go rook e8? Finally, rook e8 is on the board. Queen d2 played by Magnus. Okay, but I'm not liking what Magnus is doing. I can just take and play queen d5. What's my problem?
Magnus is playing for the clock at this stage. He's sensing that Artemiev, he is a little bit too methodical in his approach, but it is a good position for black, as you mentioned. We saw the trade on b3, but no follow-up just yet. It took him a few seconds to play queen d5. He has enough time, Peter, but I'm just getting concerned that if every move he's spending 3 seconds instead of responding instantly, that could get him in danger.
Maybe, but I'm having this feeling that if we would ask now, we would have the chance to ask Vladislav, how do you feel about this? He would say, yes, I'm happy with my situation because with the black pieces, I have a perfectly normal position against Magnus. The clock I will handle somehow.
But look at this. The queen went to f4. Can you take on b3? You have to calculate it. And it looks like instead of taking, Artemiev moves back bishop e6. It is a good move. It keeps everything under control. The c7 pawn at some point will be vulnerable, but for now, b3 is more important. So I think Magnus, he can try a move like b4, which is super ugly for his dark square bishop. But I don't think you want to take on c7 and allow queen takes b3. That looks like it plays into black's hands.
Yes, absolutely. The b3 pawn is very important. It's all about the light squares. The c7 pawn is also typically in the Petrov defense, not something that black really worries about if he gets the control of the light squares. Also, not to forget about black's queenside majority. Yeah, with some a5 ideas, and there you go. That's why Magnus plays this ugly move b4 to stop a5. Yeah, at
And you could
least
see. Sorry,
yes.
Peter. I was going to say you could see him shake his head. He didn't want to play that move, but he felt he had to.
Yes, and that's the point. Yeah, after queen b3, he also has to fall back with his queen to c1, protecting the bishop on ac and the pawn on the other hand. The knight is ready to be re-employed. And there we see, do we gonna see a repetition of moves?
I think Magnus should be happy with a repetition because his position is bad, but Artemiev's clock is not so good. So here comes the queen back to b3. Magnus doesn't really have a choice besides queen c1. His bishop is under attack, as is that pawn on c3. But maybe he will move his knight. So he wants to put Artemiev on the clock. So if queen c1, queen d5, as you said, knight d2 becomes a possibility.
Well, knight d2 was my idea to kick the queen out, but that's why Artemiev also plays the move queen d5. Knight d2 can be met by bishop g5, for example, pinning that knight. Yeah, and that's it. Repetition of moves, shake hands, draw agreed by repetition.
Artemiev is too darn solid. What a classy player he is.